What if I told you that one ship changed naval history forever? Not because of the battle it fought, but because of the nightmare that followed its sinking. Imagine surviving one of the deadliest naval disasters of World War II, only to spend 4 endless days floating in the open Pacific Ocean. No food, almost no fresh water. The blazing tropical sun burned your skin by day. The freezing ocean stole your body heat by night. Around you floated hundreds of exhausted sailors, and beneath you, shadows. At first, they were only distant shapes moving through the deep blue water. Then, one of the men beside you suddenly screamed. He disappeared beneath the surface. Moments later, the sea turned red. The sharks had arrived. Over the next 4 days, hundreds of American sailors would die, not from enemy fire, but from thirst, exhaustion, saltwater poisoning, exposure, and one of the largest shark attacks in recorded history. When rescue finally arrived, only 316 men remained alive. Everything else had disappeared into the Pacific. This is the true story of the USS Indianapolis. During the summer of 1945, the Second World War was entering its final chapter. Germany had already surrendered in Europe. Across the Pacific, however, the fighting continued with terrifying intensity. Every island captured by American forces came at an enormous cost. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Instead, many fought until death. Military planners feared that an invasion of mainland Japan would become the bloodiest operation in modern history. The United States desperately searched for a way to end the war. Deep inside laboratories hidden across America, thousands of scientists were working on a project so secret that even Vice President Harry Truman knew almost nothing about it: the Manhattan Project. For more than 3 years, America's greatest scientific minds had raced against time to build a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. If successful, it could end the war in a single devastating blow. But first, the weapon's most critical components had to reach the Pacific safely. Only a handful of people knew what those mysterious wooden crates actually contained. One ship would carry them. That ship was USS Indianapolis. Commissioned in 1932, USS Indianapolis belonged to the Portland-class heavy cruisers of the United States Navy. She measured more than 610 feet in length. Her powerful engines could drive the massive warship across the ocean at speeds exceeding 32 knots. 8 massive 8-inch guns dominated her deck. Dozens of anti-aircraft weapons surrounded the ship. She carried advanced radar, experienced officers, and one of the finest crews in the American fleet. Before 1945, USS Indianapolis had already earned an impressive reputation. It transported President Franklin Roosevelt during official inspections. It supported numerous amphibious invasions throughout the Pacific Campaign. It survived Japanese kamikaze attacks. Again and again, she completed dangerous missions while earning the respect of sailors across the Navy. Her crew trusted her completely. Few believed anything could bring her down. In July 1945, Indianapolis arrived at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. Workers immediately surrounded the vessel. Security, unlike anything the crew had ever seen, suddenly appeared. Armed guards stood watch around sealed wooden crates. Nobody was allowed near them. No questions were answered. The sailors became curious. Some guessed the boxes contained gold. Others believed they carried secret intelligence documents. A few joked they were transporting supplies for General Douglas MacArthur. None imagined the truth. Inside one crate rested the uranium core destined for the atomic bomb, later known as Little Boy. Other containers held essential bomb components that scientists desperately needed on Tinian Island. Without this shipment, history itself might have unfolded very differently. On July 16, 1945,
While Indianapolis prepared to leave California, another event occurred thousands of miles away in the New Mexico desert. A brilliant flash brighter than the sun illuminated the early morning sky. The world's first successful nuclear explosion shook the Earth. Scientists watched in stunned silence. Some celebrated, others immediately feared what humanity had just created. The atomic age had begun. Yet the crew aboard Indianapolis knew nothing about any of this. They simply received sealed orders: deliver the cargo, travel alone, maintain maximum speed, tell no one what you are carrying. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III read his confidential instructions carefully. A career naval officer with decades of experience, McVeigh understood secrecy. He informed his officers only of what they absolutely needed to know. The mission appeared straightforward: sail west across the Pacific, avoid unnecessary stops, deliver the cargo immediately, return for further orders. Time mattered more than anything. Every hour saved could shorten the war. Indianapolis departed San Francisco on July 16, 1945. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before her. The crew settled into familiar routines. Some played cards below deck, others cleaned equipment or maintained engines. Mail call remained the happiest part of each day. Many sailors carried photographs of wives, girlfriends, parents, or children safely tucked inside their uniforms. They dreamed of home. Most believed the war would soon end. No one realized they were sailing towards one of the greatest tragedies in American naval history.
The voyage across the Pacific was unlike any mission USS Indianapolis had ever undertaken. Unlike most wartime operations, there were no escort ships surrounding her. No destroyers zigzagged ahead searching for submarines. No aircraft circled overhead. She sailed completely alone. The Navy believed speed would be her greatest protection. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III understood the risks. Japanese submarines were still active throughout the Pacific. Although Japan's Navy had been devastated during the war, isolated submarines continued hunting American ships wherever they could. Every sunset reminded the crew that dangers still lurked beneath the waves. Still, morale remained surprisingly high. The weather was calm, the sea stretched endlessly beneath brilliant blue skies. Many sailors believed they were simply delivering another classified shipment. Few paid much attention to the armed Marines guarding the mysterious cargo. Whatever was inside those heavy wooden crates was clearly important, but questions were discouraged. The less anyone knew, the safer the mission would remain. Every morning began the same way. Boatswain whistles echoed across the steel decks. Sailors scrubbed the wooden planks until they gleamed. Engine crews inspected boilers. Signalmen checked communication equipment. Lookouts scanned the empty horizon through binoculars. Even during wartime, routine created a sense of normal life. Meals became moments everyone looked forward to. The cooks served powdered eggs, canned meat, bread, coffee, and whatever fresh supplies remained from California. The food was not luxurious, but after years of war, nobody complained. Laughter often filled the mess hall. Young sailors joked about finally returning home. Some argued over baseball scores. Others debated what they would do after the war. One dreamed of opening a garage in Ohio. Another wanted to attend college using the benefits promised to returning veterans. Several planned to marry as soon as they stepped off the ship. None imagined these ordinary conversations would become their final memories. The Pacific itself seemed peaceful. Flying fish occasionally leaped across the waves. Dolphins raced beside the cruiser. At night, the ocean glowed with brilliant blue bioluminescence as the ship slisked through the dark water. For many sailors, it was one of the most beautiful sights they had ever witnessed. Far below that peaceful surface, however, another story was unfolding. Hundreds of miles away, a Japanese submarine commander searched patiently for American ships. His name was Commander Mochitsuda Hashimoto. He commanded the submarine I-58. Hashimoto had spent years fighting across the Pacific. He understood the war was nearly lost, American aircraft dominated the skies. Japanese cities suffered devastating bombing raids. Fuel shortages crippled the Imperial Navy, yet his mission remained unchanged: destroy every enemy vessel possible. Each morning, I-58 quietly surfaced to recharge its batteries. Crewmen inspected torpedoes. Radio operators intercepted American transmissions whenever possible. The submarine disappeared beneath the waves before daylight revealed its position. Life aboard the submarine was exhausting. Space was incredibly limited. The air smelled of diesel fuel, machinery, sweat, and seawater. Fresh food disappeared quickly. Humidity covered every surface. Despite the discomfort, discipline never weakened. Every sailor knew a single mistake could send the submarine to the bottom forever. Neither Captain McVeigh nor Commander Hashimoto knew their paths were rapidly converging. Meanwhile, USS Indianapolis continued setting remarkable speed records. The heavy cruiser crossed nearly 5,000 miles from California to Pearl Harbor in just a few days. After only a brief stop for fuel, she immediately sailed onward toward Tinian Island. No delays, no ceremonies. The cargo had absolute priority. On July 26, 1945, Indianapolis arrived at Tinian. Few sailors realized the island had quietly become one of the most important military locations in the world. Massive airfields stretched across the landscape. Hundreds of B-29 Superfortress bombers lined the runways. Thousands of soldiers worked day and night behind strict security. The mysterious cargo was unloaded immediately. Waiting officers signed documents without revealing their contents. Within minutes, heavily guarded trucks carried the wooden crates away. The mission was complete, or so everyone believed. The uranium components delivered by Indianapolis would soon become part of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Historians later concluded that no naval delivery during World War II carried greater historical significance. Without realizing it, the crew had helped deliver one of the most consequential weapons ever created. They received no celebration, no speeches, no medals. Most never even learned what they had transported. After refueling, USS Indianapolis received new orders: proceed to Guam. From there, continue toward Leyte in the Philippines to prepare for future operations. It sounded routine. The crew relaxed. The dangerous secret mission was finally over. Surely the hardest part lay behind them. Captain McVeigh reviewed intelligence reports before departure. Several Japanese submarines had recently been reported operating in the region. However, Naval headquarters considered the threat relatively low. One recommendation remained optional. Captains could zigzag while sailing to make submarine attacks more difficult, but zigzagging reduced overall speed. Since no confirmed submarine sightings existed along Indianapolis's route, Captain McVeigh decided to maintain a direct course whenever visibility remained poor. The decision would later become one of the most controversial choices in American naval history. Yet many historians point out that numerous captains made exactly the same decision under similar circumstances. At the time, it seemed entirely reasonable. The cruiser departed Tinian. The ocean once again stretched endlessly ahead. Behind them, workers quietly assembled the bomb that would change history. Ahead waited darkness none of them could imagine. Far beneath the Pacific, Commander Hashimoto continued his patrol. Night after night, his submarine drifted silently through black water. Then, just before midnight on July 29, 1945, a lookout spotted something extraordinary on the horizon. A silhouette, large, fast, moving alone. Hashimoto immediately climbed into the periscope. He adjusted the focus carefully. There it was, an American heavy cruiser. No escort ships, no destroyers, no aircraft. Completely alone. It was the greatest opportunity of his career.
Inside USS Indianapolis, most of the crew slept peacefully. The engines hummed steadily beneath the steel decks. Some sailors stood watch beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Others wrote letters they hoped to mail at the next port. A few quietly played cards in dimly lit compartments. Nobody noticed the submarine slowly moving into attack position. Nobody heard the torpedo tubes flooding with seawater. Nobody saw Commander Hashimoto calculating speed, distance, and angle through his periscope. The ocean remained perfectly calm. For a few final moments, everything felt completely normal. Then, at exactly 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, Commander Hashimoto gave a single order: fire.
At exactly 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto lowered his eye from the submarine's periscope. For several tense seconds, nobody aboard I-58 spoke. Every sailor waited. The torpedoes had already left their tubes. Now there was nothing left to do except watch. Hashimoto quietly counted the seconds. 10, 20, 30. Then, a brilliant flash erupted across the dark Pacific. The first torpedo slammed into USS Indianapolis with tremendous force. The explosion ripped through the starboard bow near the forward ammunition storage. Steel plates twisted like paper. Thousands of gallons of seawater burst into the ship. Men sleeping below deck were thrown violently from their bunks. Before anyone fully understood what had happened, a second explosion struck. This one was even more devastating. The second torpedo smashed directly into the engineering spaces. Boilers exploded. Steam pipes burst. The electrical generators instantly failed. The lights aboard the ship disappeared. Darkness swallowed everything. For one terrifying moment, the only light came from burning fuel and exploding machinery. The peaceful Pacific night transformed into absolute chaos. The entire cruiser shook violently. Steel screamed. Glass shattered. Men were thrown across compartments. Some slammed into walls. Others disappeared beneath collapsing equipment. Below deck, temperatures instantly reached unbearable levels. Scalding steam blasted through broken pipes. Some sailors never even had a chance to escape. Entire compartments flooded within seconds. Heavy steel doors slammed shut automatically to slow the flooding. For dozens of trapped sailors, those doors became permanent prison walls. They pounded desperately against them. Their shipmates outside could hear the screams, but nothing could be done. The water was rising too quickly. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh was asleep in his cabin when the first explosion hurled him from his bunk. He struck the deck hard. Before he could regain his balance, the second explosion rocked the ship. The lights vanished. Emergency alarms echoed throughout the cruiser. McVeigh rushed toward the bridge. Smoke already filled the passageways. Men stumbled through the darkness carrying injured shipmates. Others searched desperately for life jackets. No one knew exactly what had happened. Some believed they had struck a mine. Others feared a massive ammunition accident. Then the reports began arriving. Torpedo hit. Engine rooms flooding. We're losing power. Massive flooding forward. Captain McVeigh immediately understood the horrifying reality. The ship was dying. He ordered emergency distress signals transmitted immediately. Radio operators rushed to their equipment. One emergency message was successfully sent. Another may have been transmitted. Historians still debate exactly how many distress calls reached American commands. The greater tragedy was that those messages would not produce an immediate rescue. Some receiving stations misunderstood them. Others assumed they were errors. One officer reportedly believed it might be a Japanese deception. Another commander chose to wait for confirmation before taking action. Hours would pass. No rescue fleet would immediately sail. Those lost hours would later cost hundreds of lives. Meanwhile, aboard Indianapolis, every second mattered. The cruiser immediately developed a dangerous list to starboard. Water poured through torn steel faster than pumps could remove it.
The bow settled lower. Captain McVeigh examined the damage. His experienced eyes recognized something almost unbelievable. Indianapolis would not survive, not for hours, not even for 1 hour. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. The command spread rapidly. Abandon ship! Abandon ship! Sailors grabbed life jackets. Some leaped directly into the ocean. Others lowered rafts. Many rafts failed to inflate correctly. Some were destroyed during the explosions. Others floated away before anyone could reach them. Fuel oil poured from ruptured tanks, spreading across the sea like a giant black blanket. Men jumped directly into burning oil. Several caught fire before reaching the water. Others inhaled thick black smoke. Many became completely covered in sticky fuel. The smell of burning oil mixed with exploding ammunition filled the night air. Everywhere, men shouted names. Friends searched desperately for one another. Corpsmen treated terrible burns with almost no medical supplies. Officers tried maintaining order despite the overwhelming panic. Some sailors calmly helped wounded shipmates reach the rails before jumping themselves. Acts of extraordinary courage appeared everywhere. One Marine removed his own life jacket and gave it to a badly injured sailor. Another officer repeatedly returned below deck, searching for trapped crew members until he never emerged again.
Engineers remained below longer than anyone else, attempting to keep essential systems operating. Many sacrificed their own escape, trying to save others. Within minutes, the ship's list became catastrophic. The bow plunged deeper beneath the Pacific. Massive 8-inch gun turrets slowly pointed toward the ocean. Loose equipment slid across tilted decks. Boats crashed free from their mounts. The stern began lifting higher into the air. Captain McVeigh remained aboard until nearly everyone possible had escaped. Only then did he finally enter the water. Behind him, USS Indianapolis continued her final descent. The entire event had lasted barely 12 minutes. 12 minutes. A warship longer than 2 football fields. Gone. As the bow disappeared beneath the waves, the stern suddenly rose almost vertically into the sky. Propellers emerged, dripping seawater. For a brief moment, the entire ship seemed frozen against the stars. Then, gravity took over. The cruiser slipped beneath the Pacific forever. A deep roar echoed through the water. Air trapped inside the sinking vessel escaped in violent explosions. The sea churned violently. Hundreds of sailors were pulled downward by the enormous suction. Some escaped. Others never resurfaced. Silence returned surprisingly quickly. The explosions stopped. The engines were gone. The ship had vanished. Only darkness remained. Scattered across miles of open ocean floated nearly 900 exhausted American sailors. Some clung to life rafts, others held on to floating debris. Many possessed only a single life jacket. Oil covered faces. Salt water stung open wounds. The nearest land lay hundreds of miles away. No rescue ships appeared. No aircraft circled overhead. Most believed help would arrive by sunrise. After all, their distress calls had surely been received. The United States Navy would never leave hundreds of sailors alone in the Pacific, would it? None of them knew that far away, critical messages had been ignored, misunderstood, or never acted upon. The rescue they expected within hours would not come. Instead, as the first light of dawn slowly spread across the endless Pacific, dark shadows began circling beneath the floating men. At first, only a few sailors noticed them. One whispered quietly, "What's that?" Another leaned closer toward the water. The shadow disappeared. Then another appeared, long, powerful, moving slowly beneath the exhausted survivors. Nobody wanted to say the word loud, but deep inside, everyone already knew. Sharks.
The first shark appeared just after sunrise. At first, it looked like nothing more than a dark shadow gliding beneath the surface. One sailor stared into the water, convinced his exhausted eyes were playing tricks on him. Then the shadow circled again, closer, larger. Its dorsal fin briefly sliced through the calm Pacific before disappearing beneath the waves. Silence spread across the survivors. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Everyone understood exactly what they were seeing. A shark. Then another fin appeared. Then another. Within minutes, dozens of dark shapes surrounded the scattered groups of sailors. The USS Indianapolis had sunk in one of the richest shark-feeding environments in the Pacific Ocean. The explosions, burning fuel, floating debris, and hundreds of struggling men had created an enormous disturbance that could be detected from miles away. Oceanic whitetips, one of the ocean's most aggressive open-water predators, had arrived. Unlike many shark species that prefer coastal waters, oceanic whitetips spend almost their entire lives in the deep ocean. They're opportunistic hunters, curious, persistent. Once food appears, they rarely leave. Most of the young sailors had never even heard of them, but the experienced Navy men immediately recognized the danger. "Stay together," an officer shouted. "Don't kick the water. Keep your legs still." The advice spread quickly. Small groups pulled themselves tightly together. They hoped the sharks might ignore a larger cluster of people. Some linked arms, others clung to floating life jackets. A few climbed onto tiny inflatable rafts, already dangerously overloaded. Every available space disappeared within minutes. Hundreds of sailors remained floating directly in the open water. The tropical sun climbed steadily higher, heat reflected from both the sky and the ocean. The temperature rose rapidly. Many survivors had escaped the sinking wearing only shorts or underwear. Others still wore heavy uniforms, soaked with seawater and fuel oil. The burning sun quickly began blistering exposed skin. Salt rubbed against open wounds. Eyes became swollen from oil and seawater. Lips cracked from dehydration. Still, nobody dared drink the ocean around them. Every sailor had been warned during survival training. Salt water would only make thirst worse. Yet, as the hours passed, that lesson became increasingly difficult to remember. Nearby, a young Marine quietly removed a photograph from inside his shirt. The picture showed his wife holding their newborn daughter. The photograph had somehow remained dry inside its protective covering. He stared at it for several minutes before carefully placing it back against his chest. "I'll be home soon," he whispered. Others made similar promises. "We'll laugh about this someday. They'll find us by tonight. The Navy knows we're missing." Hope remained surprisingly strong. After all, the United States Navy controlled much of the Pacific. Hundreds of ships crossed these waters every day. Surely someone would notice their absence. Surely aircraft would soon appear overhead. Hour after hour, the sky remained empty. Late that morning, the first attack came. No warning, no splash. One sailor simply vanished beneath the surface. The men beside him screamed. For several terrifying seconds, bubbles rose where he had been floating. Then the water exploded into violent movement. A dark fin cut across the surface. The ocean turned red. The attack lasted less than 10 seconds. When the water became calm again, nothing remained. The surrounding sailors stared in complete shock. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt almost unreal. Then another scream echoed across the water. Farther away, another man disappeared. Panic spread rapidly. Some survivors began kicking desperately toward nearby rafts. Others splashed wildly, trying to escape invisible predators beneath them. Ironically, the splashing attracted even more sharks.
Experienced officers immediately tried restoring order. Stay calm, stay together, don't panic. Their voices competed against growing fear. Every ripple beneath the surface now seemed terrifying. Every passing shadow caused dozens of men to hold their breath. Some survivors later described constantly imagining something brushing against their legs. Sometimes it was only floating rope, sometimes drifting debris, sometimes it wasn't. Throughout the afternoon, isolated attacks continued. Rarely did sharks attack large groups. Instead, they often targeted sailors drifting alone, men who had become separated, the wounded, the exhausted, those who drifted too far from everyone else. The attacks became psychological torture. The sharks rarely rushed. They circled patiently, watching, waiting. The survivors could never predict when one would strike. Every minute became unbearable. As daylight slowly faded, another danger emerged: the sea itself. Gentle swells grew larger. Each wave lifted survivors several feet before dropping them again. Groups repeatedly drifted apart. Friends disappeared behind rolling walls of water. Some called familiar names into the darkness. Others answered from somewhere far away. Many voices gradually fell silent forever. Night arrived with almost no moonlight. Darkness covered the Pacific. The temperature dropped dramatically. Men who had baked beneath tropical sunlight now began shivering uncontrollably. Hyperthermia slowly replaced heat exhaustion. Bodies weakened, muscles cramped. Sleep became impossible. Every sound seemed amplified. The slap of small waves, the distant cries of injured sailors, occasional splashes, sometimes a sudden scream, then silence. Nobody knew whether another shark had attacked or someone had simply slipped beneath the surface from exhaustion. The uncertainty became almost worse than certainty. Captain Charles McVeigh floated with one of the larger survivor groups. Even now, he continued encouraging his men. He moved constantly between clusters of sailors, checking injuries, offering reassurance, reminding everyone that rescue would come. Inside, he carried a growing weight of responsibility. Had he done enough? Had his distress signals reached anyone? Would rescue ships arrive at dawn? He had no answers. Far away, American naval headquarters continued operating normally. Ships departed ports. Aircraft followed scheduled patrols. Messages arrived and were filed. Yet nobody realized nearly 900 sailors floated helplessly in the Pacific. A critical tracking mistake had occurred. Indianapolis had never been officially reported overdue. No automatic search had begun. One paperwork failure, one communication breakdown, one assumption would become one of the greatest administrative disasters in United States naval history. Back in the ocean, morning finally returned. Many survivors welcomed daylight. Others immediately wished for darkness again. What sunlight revealed shocked everyone. The number of men had noticeably decreased. Groups that had filled entire sections of ocean the previous evening had grown dramatically smaller. Floating bodies drifted silently between the living. Oil still covered the surface. Life jackets floated empty. Some rafts had disappeared completely. The sharks remained. Their dark fins continued cutting slowly through the endless blue water. The second day had begun, and rescue still had not come. Then another nightmare started. The fresh water was gone, and for hundreds of exhausted American sailors, thirst would soon become deadlier than the sharks.
The third sunrise brought no rescue ships, no aircraft, no radio calls. only an endless blue horizon stretching in every direction. By now, many survivors had stopped asking when help would arrive. Instead, a far more immediate question haunted every exhausted sailor. How much longer could the human body survive without fresh water? The answer was frightening. The tropical Pacific surrounded them with billions of gallons of water, yet not a single drop was safe to drink. Salt water only accelerated dehydration. Every sailor knew that. Every sailor had been warned. But knowledge becomes difficult to remember when your tongue feels like sandpaper. The first signs appeared quietly. Lips cracked open until they bled. Voices became weak and hoarse. Eyes sank deep into exhausted faces. Simple conversations required enormous effort. Some men could no longer swallow. Others stared silently at the waves, imagining cool glasses of water waiting back home. One sailor whispered constantly about lemonade. Another described the ice-cold well behind his family's farmhouse in Kansas. Someone else laughed softly while describing milkshakes from a small diner in California. The conversations sounded almost normal, but they weren't. The mind was beginning to fail. Captain Charles McVeigh continued moving among the floating groups. He encouraged everyone to stay awake. Think about home. Think about your family. They're looking for us. We're going to make it. His words helped for a while, but nature had begun attacking from every direction. The sun burned relentlessly overhead. Without shade, exposed skin blistered badly. Shoulders turned dark red. Faces swelled until some men could barely open their eyes. Life jackets rubbed against raw skin with every wave. Salt entered open wounds. Pain became constant. The ocean itself seemed determined to wear them down. Sharks still circled. They attacked less frequently during daylight than many expected. Instead, they waited. Sometimes a fin appeared only a few feet away before disappearing beneath the surface. Sometimes several sharks slowly circled a survivor for minutes without striking. The psychological pressure became unbearable. Every sailor knew the predators were still there, watching, waiting. Several corpsmen tried caring for the wounded, despite having almost nothing to work with. Burn victims suffered terribly. Many had escaped through burning fuel after the ship exploded. Their skin peeled away beneath the tropical sun. Broken bones remained untreated. Deep cuts became infected almost immediately. Yet even now, acts of kindness continued. One sailor carefully adjusted another man's life jacket every hour because he was too weak to do it himself. Another spent precious energy supporting an injured friend whose arms could no longer keep him afloat. Several officers voluntarily remained with badly wounded sailors rather than drifting toward safer groups. Courage had not disappeared. It simply looked different now. By afternoon, hallucinations began. At first, they were harmless. One man smiled happily. "Can you hear that?" "Hear what?" "The music." Everyone listened. There was nothing. Another sailor pointed excitedly toward the horizon. "There, a ship!" Dozens turned hopefully. The horizon remained empty. Some survivors became convinced rescue destroyers floated only a few hundred yards away. Others believed they could see tropical islands covered with palm trees. Several claimed airplanes circled overhead. Nothing was there. The human brain, desperate for hope, had begun creating its own reality. Then came the thirst. One Marine suddenly leaned forward. Without warning, he scooped seawater into his hands and drank. Several nearby sailors grabbed him immediately. "No! Spit it out! It's salt water!" He struggled violently. "I'm thirsty! I don't care! Just let me drink!" They forced him to stop. For a few hours, he seemed calmer. Then, everything changed.
Saltwater poisoning attacks both the body and the mind. Within hours, his confusion became severe. He started laughing uncontrollably, then crying, then shouting at people who weren't there. Finally, he tore off his life jacket. "I'm swimming home!" he yelled. Before anyone could stop him, he disappeared into the open Pacific. Nobody ever saw him again. It wasn't an isolated tragedy. Throughout the day, more survivors made the same fatal decision. Some insisted fresh water waited just beyond the next wave. Others believed beaches lay only minutes away. Several swam confidently toward imaginary ships. Within minutes, they vanished into the distance. Sometimes sharks followed. Sometimes exhaustion claimed them first. The survivors watched helplessly. Trying to stop everyone had become impossible. The ocean was slowly stealing minds before it stole lives. As evening approached, the groups became noticeably smaller again. Captain McVeigh counted faces. Too many were missing. Some had died quietly during the afternoon. Others had drifted away. Many had simply slipped beneath the surface without making a sound. The strongest sailors now carried another burden: hope itself. If they lost hope, everyone else would soon follow. One young officer gathered several frightened sailors around him. Instead of talking about the ocean, he talked about baseball, the New York Yankees, Joe DiMaggio, World Series games. For nearly an hour, the men argued passionately about batting averages. For that brief moment, they forgot where they were, forgot the sharks, forgot the thirst, forgot the bodies floating nearby. One survivor later said that conversation probably saved several lives, because while people kept talking, they kept fighting. Night returned once again. The stars looked impossibly beautiful. Millions of bright lights covered the sky. Some sailors stared upward for hours. Others quietly prayed. Catholics crossed themselves. Protestants recited familiar Bible verses. Men who had never attended church whispered desperate prayers into the darkness. "Please, just let me see my mother again." Another quietly promised, "If I survive this, I'll never waste another day." Nearby, a sailor softly began singing "America the Beautiful." His cracked voice barely carried across the waves. One by one, others joined him. Weak voices, broken voices, but voices filled with determination. The song drifted across the Pacific night. Some cried while singing, some smiled, others simply listened. Even the sharks seemed to disappear for those few precious minutes. Far above, the stars continued shining, completely unaware of the suffering below. Then, near midnight, a terrified scream shattered the silence. Something powerful had struck one of the survivor groups. The water erupted into violent splashing. Dark fins cut through the moonlit ocean. Men shouted desperately. Several disappeared beneath the waves. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. When it ended, only silence remained. Nobody slept after that. Nobody could. The fourth sunrise was only hours away, and with it, the survivors would face one final test. Not against sharks, not against thirst, but against the terrifying possibility that nobody was coming.
Morning came slowly. The fourth sunrise painted the Pacific in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Under different circumstances, it would have been breathtaking. Now, no one even looked at it. The survivors looked only toward the horizon, searching, waiting, praying. Still, nothing. No ships, no airplanes, no smoke. Only the endless ocean. Nearly 80 hours had passed since USS Indianapolis disappeared beneath the waves. The men who remained alive no longer resembled the confident sailors who had departed Tinian. Their faces were swollen beyond recognition. Their lips were split and bleeding. Many could barely keep their eyes open. Their skin, burned by the tropical sun and soaked in salt water, peeled away in painful strips. Every movement hurt. Every breath required effort. Some men had become too weak to speak. Others simply floated in silence, staring into nothing. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh looked around at what remained of his crew. The sight broke his heart. Hundreds of familiar faces were gone. Some were close friends. Some had served beside him for years. Others had been barely 18 years old. Now, only a fraction remained. Yet even now, discipline had not completely disappeared. Several officers continued organizing the survivors into small groups. Corpsmen checked on the wounded. The strongest men helped support those drifting toward unconsciousness. No one had given up, not completely. Then, something remarkable happened. One sailor suddenly pointed toward the sky. Listen. At first, nobody heard anything. Only wind, only waves. Then, a distant sound, very faint, like a tiny buzzing somewhere beyond the clouds. Several men lifted their heads. The sound grew louder. Hope exploded through the exhausted groups. An airplane! An airplane! Some survivors waved weakly. Others shouted until their cracked voices disappeared. But the aircraft never appeared. The sound slowly faded. Silence returned. It had been nothing more than imagination. The disappointment was devastating. Several men lowered their heads. One quietly whispered, "We're not going home." Another simply closed his eyes. Despair spread faster than exhaustion ever had. The mind was reaching its limit. Hallucinations became even more intense. One sailor laughed happily. "My mother is standing right there." He smiled toward empty ocean. Another reached his hands into the air. "I can almost touch the beach." There was no beach, only endless water. Some survivors became convinced the ocean itself had become fresh water. They scooped handful after handful into their mouths. Friends desperately tried stopping them. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't. Those who drank seawater deteriorated rapidly. Within hours, they became violently confused. Many tore away their life jackets. Some believed they could walk across the water. Others claimed rescue ships waited just beneath the surface. One by one, they disappeared. The remaining survivors watched helplessly. Nobody possessed enough strength to chase them anymore. Around noon, the sharks returned. Not in large numbers, just enough to remind everyone they had never truly left. A lone fin appeared beside one group, then another. The predators moved slowly, patiently. One exhausted sailor drifted slightly away from the others, perhaps only 15 feet. He tried swimming back. His arms barely moved. Suddenly, the water erupted. A powerful tail struck the surface. The man screamed once, only once. Then he vanished. The surrounding survivors froze. Nobody cried out. Nobody splashed. Fear had become too familiar. Some simply closed their eyes. Others quietly prayed. One Marine whispered, "Please, make it quick if it's my turn." Time itself seemed to stop. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. The blazing sun climbed overhead once more. Some men slipped into unconsciousness while still floating upright inside their life jackets. Friends gently shook them awake. "Don't sleep. You have to stay awake. If you sleep, you won't wake up." Those words became the group's only mission. Stay alive. Stay awake. One sailor began quietly reciting the names of every state in America. Another continued where he left off, naming every Major League Baseball team. Someone else started singing. His voice was almost gone. Still, others joined him, not because they had strength, because they needed something stronger than silence. Far away, more than 300 miles from the survivors, a Lockheed PV-1 Ventura pilot bomber lifted off for what should have been a completely routine mission. Its pilot was Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn. His orders were simple: fly a standard anti-submarine patrol, search for enemy submarines. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. He had absolutely no idea that hundreds of American sailors were still alive beneath his flight path. Hour after hour, the aircraft crossed the Pacific. Below, the survivors continued drifting. Many no longer noticed day or night. The ocean had become their entire world. Then, at approximately 11:25 in the morning, Lieutenant Gwynn glanced out his cockpit window. Something caught his attention. An unusual oil split spread across the water. At first, he assumed it marked the location of a recently submerged submarine. He banked the aircraft lower for a better look. Then, he saw movement. Hundreds, no, dozens, people, floating. His heart nearly stopped. He lowered the aircraft even farther. Now there was no doubt. The ocean below was filled with American sailors. Some waved weakly, some barely moved, others floated face down. Lieutenant Gwynn immediately grabbed his radio. "This is a priority message. I have located survivors in the water. There are hundreds of them. Send every available rescue unit immediately." His voice shook with disbelief. Back at headquarters, operators could hardly believe what they were hearing. Hundreds of survivors in the middle of the Pacific? How? From where? Within minutes, rescue operations finally began. For the exhausted sailors below, the aircraft circling overhead looked almost unreal. Many believed it was another hallucination. Several refused to look. Others cried uncontrollably. One survivor whispered, "Please, don't disappear." This time, it didn't. The aircraft remained, flying circles above them, rocking its wings. The crew dropped life rafts and emergency supplies into the ocean. Some drifted beyond reach. Others landed close enough to save lives. For the first time in nearly 4 days, hope became real. The nightmare was finally ending. But one extraordinary act of heroism was still about to unfold. An act so courageous that it would become one of the greatest rescue stories in United States Navy history. For nearly 4 endless days, the men had stared at an empty sky. Now, an airplane circled above them. Some survivors wept openly. Others could only smile through swollen, cracked lips. A few were too weak even to raise their hands. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn banked his PV-1 Ventura sharply to avoid losing sight of the drifting sailors. What he saw below would haunt him for the rest of his life. The ocean was covered with tiny groups of men. Some floated in neat circles, others drifted alone. Bodies lay motionless among the living. Oil stretched across the sea for miles. Even from several hundred feet above, the devastation was unmistakable. "This is far worse than I imagined," Gwynn whispered. His radio operator continued broadcasting emergency messages. Survivors located, hundreds in the water, immediate rescue required. Every available ship, every available aircraft, everything that could move was ordered toward the coordinates. But there was one terrible problem. The nearest rescue ships were still many hours away. Some were more than 100 miles distant. For the exhausted survivors, every additional hour could mean dozens more deaths. Meanwhile, another aircraft was racing toward the scene. It was a massive PBY Catalina flying boat commanded by Adrian Marks. Unlike ordinary aircraft, the Catalina could land directly on the ocean. Marks received the emergency report while preparing for a completely different mission. The moment he understood what had happened, he pushed his crew to maximum speed. Inside the Catalina, silence filled the cockpit.
Everyone knew they were flying towards something extraordinary. No one expected what they were about to witness. As the aircraft approached the reported position, the crew spotted the oil slick first. Then, the men. Hundreds of tiny figures scattered across the endless Pacific. Even experienced military aviators struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The radio operator spoke quietly. "My God." Mark circled lower. Everywhere he looked, survivors waved weakly. Some held pieces of wreckage. Others floated almost motionless inside worn life jackets. Dark fins occasionally cut through the water. The sharks were still there. Marks faced an impossible decision. Official Navy regulations strictly prohibited landing the Catalina in rough open ocean. The swells were too dangerous. The aircraft could easily break apart. If it crashed, his own crew might join the disaster. But as he watched another exhausted sailor disappear beneath the surface, the decision became easy. "I don't care what the regulations say. We're landing." His crew looked at him. Nobody argued. Everyone understood. The Catalina descended carefully toward the water. The swells pounded against its hull. Each impact threatened to tear the aircraft apart. Finally, the flying boat touched down. Water exploded around the pontoons. The Catalina bounced violently across the Pacific before finally slowing to a stop. Cheers erupted from nearby survivors. For the first time in nearly 4 days, someone had reached them. Marks immediately opened the side hatch. Crew members began pulling exhausted sailors aboard. Many survivors were unable to climb. They simply collapsed against the aircraft. One by one, the crew lifted them inside. Some survivors cried. Others kissed the metal floor. Several could only whisper one word: water. Fresh water. The crew handed out small amounts carefully. Too much too quickly could be dangerous after severe dehydration. Every sip felt miraculous. One rescued sailor later said it tasted better than anything he had ever experienced in his life. Within minutes, the Catalina became dangerously overcrowded. Its cabin was designed for a small flight crew. Now, dozens of survivors filled every available space. Still, hundreds remained in the water. Marks refused to leave them. His crew tied ropes to the aircraft's wings. More survivors were secured outside the airplane itself. Others clung to ropes trailing behind. By now, the Catalina carried far more weight than it had ever been designed to handle. Taking off again became impossible. Marks knew it. He didn't care. His airplane had become a floating lifeboat. Throughout the afternoon, he continued rescuing every man he possibly could. Far above, additional Navy aircraft arrived. They dropped more life rafts, medical supplies, food, radio beacons. The sky that had remained empty for 4 days suddenly filled with American airplanes. For many survivors, the sight was overwhelming. Some laughed, some prayed, some simply stared upward in disbelief. Night approached once again. This time, they were no longer alone. Destroyers raced across the Pacific at full speed. The first to arrive was USS Cecil J. Doyle. Its commanding officer, Commander William Graham Clayton Jr., received reports describing hundreds of exhausted sailors still floating in darkness. Normally, warships traveled with navigation lights turned off during wartime. Visible lights could attract enemy submarines. Clayton made a remarkable decision. He ordered every searchlight aboard his destroyer turned on. The ship blazed like a floating city in the middle of the Pacific. Many officers feared the lights would make them easy targets. Clayton answered simply, "I'd rather save our men." Miles away, the survivors saw something impossible, a bright light on the horizon. Not another hallucination, not the rising moon, a real ship. As USS Cecil J. Doyle approached, sailors leaned over the rails shouting encouragement. "We've got you. Hold on. We're here." Those words echoed across the dark Pacific. For many survivors, they were the most beautiful words they had ever heard. Rescue boats entered the water immediately. One exhausted sailor reached a rescue boat. The moment strong hands pulled him aboard, he burst into tears. Not because of pain, not because of fear, because he finally believed he was going home. Throughout the night, more destroyers arrived. USS Bassett, USS Ringness, USS Register. One after another, American warships searched the darkness. Floodlights swept across the waves. Rescue crews hauled survivors aboard. Doctors worked without rest. Corpsmen treated burns, dehydration, broken bones, infections, and severe shock. Blankets covered shivering men. Hot soup was prepared. Fresh water flowed freely for the first time in days. Some survivors immediately fell asleep. Others remained awake, unable to believe the nightmare had truly ended. When the final count was completed, the numbers stunned everyone. Approximately 1,195 men had sailed aboard USS Indianapolis. About 300 died during the sinking. Nearly 900 entered the Pacific alive. Only 316 survived. More than 800 American sailors had been lost. It was one of the deadliest disasters in United States naval history. Yet for many of the men who had survived, the nightmare was far from over, because after surviving torpedoes, sharks, starvation, dehydration, and 4 days in the Pacific, they would soon discover that someone had to be blamed, and the United States Navy had already chosen its target, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III.
The survivors believed the nightmare was finally over. They had endured torpedoes, a sinking warship, 4 endless days beneath the burning Pacific sun, sharks, hallucinations, thirst so unbearable that many men willingly drank seawater, knowing it could kill them. Surely, nothing else could hurt them now. They were wrong. As the rescue ships returned to port, doctors immediately began treating the survivors. Many could barely walk. Some had lost over 20 pounds in only a few days. Nearly everyone suffered severe dehydration. Sunburn covered their bodies from toe to toe. Skin peeled away in large sheets. Saltwater sores infected open wounds. Several sailors had broken bones that had gone untreated since the sinking. Others stared silently into space, unable to answer even the simplest questions. The physical injuries were obvious. The psychological wounds were far deeper. Doctors quickly noticed something unusual. Many survivors refused to sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw sharks. Some woke screaming in the middle of the night. Others instinctively kicked their legs as though something beneath the bed was grabbing them. One sailor admitted he could still hear the voices of friends calling for help. Another confessed he could smell fuel oil even while standing on dry land. Years later, psychologists would recognize these symptoms as what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1945, very few people understood it. Most survivors were simply told to move on, but moving on was impossible. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another event was unfolding. On August 6, 1945, only days after the rescue, a single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima. Inside its bomb bay rested the weapon whose critical uranium components had been delivered by USS Indianapolis. At 8:15 a.m., the atomic bomb detonated over the Japanese city. The explosion changed history forever. 3 days later, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Less than 1 week after that, Japan announced its surrender. World War II had finally ended. Many Americans celebrated. Parades filled city streets. Families welcomed soldiers home. Newspapers praised the heroes who had won the war. Yet the story of USS Indianapolis remained strangely absent. Military officials focused on victory. Questions about the disaster received little attention. But inside the Navy, someone had to explain why one of America's finest cruisers had vanished so suddenly. Investigators immediately began collecting reports. They interviewed survivors. They examined radio logs. They studied submarine patrol reports. Very quickly, one uncomfortable truth emerged. The Navy itself had made several catastrophic mistakes. Indianapolis had transmitted distress signals, yet no immediate rescue had been launched. Multiple commands had received messages. Some officers assumed they were mistakes. Others believed the transmissions might be enemy deception. Even worse, no one noticed when the cruiser failed to arrive at its scheduled destination. No automatic search began. For days, nearly 900 American sailors floated in the Pacific, while the Navy had no idea they were missing. It was an administrative disaster, unlike anything seen during the war. Someone would almost certainly be blamed. The question was, who? Attention soon turned toward Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III. Many officers respected him. He had served honorably for decades. He had commanded Indianapolis through numerous combat operations. His crew trusted him. Yet investigators focused on one particular decision. During portions of the voyage, Captain McVeigh had not zigzagged. Zigzagging forced submarines to predict constantly changing courses, making torpedo attacks more difficult. Although Navy guidance often recommended zigzagging, it was not always mandatory. Captains frequently sailed straight when visibility was poor or submarine activity seemed unlikely. McVeigh believed his decision matched both existing orders and current conditions. Many other captains had made exactly the same choice. Nevertheless, the investigation continued. Then something extraordinary happened. For the first time in United States Navy history, the commander of the enemy submarine, Commander Motsuchida Hashimoto, was invited to testify. Hashimoto traveled across the Pacific. He entered an American courtroom wearing his former Imperial Navy uniform. The room fell completely silent. Only weeks earlier, the United States and Japan had been bitter enemies. Now, the man who had sunk Indianapolis stood before American officers. He calmly described the attack. Then came the most surprising moment of the entire trial. Hashimoto testified that even if USS Indianapolis had been zigzagging continuously, he still believed he would have hit the ship. The cruiser had entered an ideal firing position. Its speed, its course, its distance, everything favored the submarine. According to the very man who fired the torpedoes, zigzagging would likely have made no difference. His testimony stunned many people inside the courtroom. Yet, it would not save Captain McVeigh. On December 19, 1945, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III became the only United States Navy captain during World War II to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. He was convicted of hazarding his ship. Although the punishment was relatively light, the emotional damage proved enormous. His military reputation never fully recovered. Many survivors refused to believe justice had been served. Several openly defended their captain. They argued that McVeigh had done everything humanly possible after the torpedo attack. He had ordered the distress signals. He had supervised the evacuation. He had remained aboard until nearly everyone else had escaped. The real failures, they insisted, occurred far above his level of command. But history rarely moves quickly. Years passed. The war faded into memory. The Indianapolis tragedy slowly disappeared
disappeared from newspaper headlines. Captain McVeigh retired from the Navy, yet the accusations followed him everywhere. Families of sailors who had died sometimes mailed him heartbreaking letters. Some blamed him directly for the loss of their sons. Others demanded explanations he could never fully provide. He answered many letters personally. He carried the weight of command every single day. Friends noticed he smiled less. He rarely discussed the war. The ocean that had once been his career became a source of lifelong pain. He often wondered the same question over and over again. Could he have saved more men? No answer ever satisfied him. Then, more than 20 years after World War II had ended, the burden finally became too heavy. On November 6, 1968, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III walked outside his home in Connecticut. He carried a small toy sailor that had belonged to his father. He also carried his Navy service revolver. Moments later, he took his own life. He was 70 years old. Many who knew him believed the guilt he carried from USS Indianapolis had never truly left him. But his story was not over, because decades later, a new generation would begin asking an uncomfortable question. What if Captain McVeigh had never been the one responsible? And what if the United States Navy itself had blamed the wrong man?
The story of USS Indianapolis remained one of America's greatest wartime tragedies. The survivors grew older. Some rarely spoke about those 4 days in the Pacific. Others spent their lives telling the story of the friends who never came home. Every reunion carried both joy and sorrow. The men embraced one another like brothers. After all, no one else could truly understand what they had endured. Yet one subject always returned: Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III. Nearly every survivor believed the same thing: their captain had been treated unfairly. Many insisted he had saved lives during the evacuation. He had remained calm. He had ordered the ship abandoned only when there was no other choice. He had entered the water only after ensuring as many men as possible had escaped. If anyone deserved blame, it was not him. Still, history had already written its verdict, or so everyone believed. As the decades passed, historians gained access to military records that had remained classified during and immediately after World War II. Those documents painted a disturbing picture. Several intelligence units had intercepted Japanese communications, warning that enemy submarines operated along Indianapolis's planned route. Yet Captain McVeigh never received those reports. Nobody warned him. He sailed directly into dangerous waters without knowing what Navy intelligence already suspected. Even more shocking, records confirmed that distress messages from Indianapolis had indeed reached American stations. One operator assumed the message was fake. Another officer reportedly feared it might be a Japanese trap. A third commander simply waited for confirmation that never came. Those delays proved catastrophic. Had rescue begun immediately, hundreds more sailors might have survived. The tragedy was no longer simply about a submarine attack. It had become a story of human error, communication failures, administrative mistakes, and decisions made far from the battlefield. Then, in an unexpected twist, a middle school student helped change history. His name was Hunter Scott. In 1996, Hunter received a school assignment for National History Day. The project asked students to research an important historical event. Most students chose famous presidents or well-known battles. Hunter chose USS Indianapolis. At first, he knew almost nothing about the ship, but the deeper he researched, the more questions appeared. Why had Captain McVeigh been blamed? Why did so many survivors insist he was innocent? The young student became fascinated. He began writing letters, making phone calls, interviewing survivors from across the country. Many were astonished that a 12-year-old cared enough to listen to their stories, Hunter eventually interviewed more than 150 survivors. Again and again, they told him the same thing: our captain was not responsible. The consistency amazed him. He continued digging through military records, reading official reports, comparing testimony. Slowly, a different picture emerged, one that challenged the Navy's official conclusion. Hunter's research soon attracted national attention. Television programs invited him for interviews. Newspapers wrote articles about the determined student uncovering forgotten history. Members of Congress noticed. Before long, Hunter Scott found himself standing inside the United States Congress. There, he calmly presented evidence gathered from survivors, historians, and declassified military documents. Lawmakers listened carefully. Many admitted they had never fully understood the Indianapolis disaster. Several survivors attended the hearings as well. Some spoke publicly about Captain McVeigh for the first time in decades. Their voices trembled with emotion. One elderly sailor looked directly at the committee and said, "Our captain saved my life. The Navy destroyed his." The room fell silent. Even experienced politicians struggled to hide their emotions. Historians added even more evidence. They pointed out that many American warships had not zigzagged during similar conditions. None of their captains had faced court-martial. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto's wartime testimony remained especially important. The man who actually fired the torpedoes continued insisting that zigzagging would not have prevented his successful attack. If the enemy commander himself believed the outcome would have remained unchanged, why had Captain McVeigh been convicted? The question became impossible to ignore. Finally, in October 2000, 55 years after USS Indianapolis disappeared beneath the Pacific, the United States Congress passed a resolution declaring that Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III should never have been blamed for the loss of his ship. The resolution stated that the evidence did not support the original court-martial. It recognized that numerous factors beyond McVeigh's control contributed to the disaster. 1 year later, the United States Navy officially placed a memorandum into Captain McVeigh's service record. His name had finally been cleared. It was one of the most remarkable reversals in American military history. Sadly, he was no longer alive to hear it. For many survivors, the moment brought mixed emotions. They celebrated. They cried. Some admitted they wished the decision had come decades earlier. Perhaps it might have saved their captain's life. But one mystery still remained. Where exactly was USS Indianapolis? The Pacific Ocean covers more than 63 million square miles. Finding a single ship resting nearly 3 miles beneath the surface seemed almost impossible. Expedition after expedition searched the area. Advanced sonar scanned the seafloor. Robotic submarines explored the darkness. Year after year, nothing. Some experts believed the wreck might never be found. Then, a forgotten wartime document changed everything. Researchers discovered an old naval landing record that more accurately described Indianapolis's final route. Using this new information, explorers narrowed the search area dramatically. In August 2017, a research vessel equipped with advanced underwater technology detected something extraordinary. Nearly 18,000 feet beneath the Pacific Ocean, a massive shape appeared on sonar. Remotely operated cameras descended into the darkness. As powerful lights illuminated the seafloor, history emerged from the shadows. There she was, USS Indianapolis, resting peacefully, exactly where she had fallen more than 70 years earlier. The bow remained remarkably intact, her massive guns still pointed silently across the ocean floor. The ship's name, Indianapolis, could still be read on the stern. Time itself seemed frozen. The ocean had protected the wreck like a giant underwater memorial. For families of the fallen, the discovery brought long-awaited closure. ship had finally been found, but her story, her sacrifice, and the courage of the men who served aboard her would never again be forgotten. The discovery of USS Indianapolis in 2017 marked the end of one search, but it did not mark the end of her story, because some stories are measured not by where they end, but by what they teach the generations that follow. More than 70 years after she disappeared beneath the Pacific Ocean, the wreck of USS Indianapolis rests nearly 18,000 feet below the surface. Down there, no sunlight exists. The water is only a few degrees above freezing. The pressure is so immense that it would crush almost any ordinary submarine in seconds. It is a world of complete darkness, yet somehow the cruiser remains. Her steel hull, scarred by war, still lies quietly on the ocean floor. Her massive guns point into the blackness, exactly where they came to rest in July 1945. Broken railings still line portions of the deck. Sections of the ship remain astonishingly intact. When remotely operated vehicles first illuminated the wreck, many historians admitted they became emotional. It was as though time itself had stopped. The Pacific had transformed the ship into an underwater memorial, a silent grave, a place where history still sleeps. For the families of 879 sailors who never returned, the discovery answered a question that had lasted for generations. Many children of the crew had grown old themselves before learning where their fathers had finally come to rest. Some grandchildren had spent years searching through military records. Others attended every reunion they could, hoping to understand the sacrifice their families carried. Now they finally knew. The ship had been found. The men had not been forgotten. Each year, survivors and families gathered together. At first, hundreds attended, then dozens. Eventually, only a handful remained. Time is undefeated. The boys, who had been 18 and 19 years old in 1945, slowly became men in their 80s and 90s. Their hair turned white, their voices became softer, their steps became slower. Yet whenever they met, they were young sailors again. They remembered names, faces, voices, small jokes shared aboard the ship, friends who had disappeared beneath the waves. Many survivors admitted something remarkable. They rarely dreamed about sharks anymore. Instead, they dreamed about the men, the conversations, the laughter, the ordinary moments before the disaster. Those were the memories they fought hardest to preserve. The USS Indianapolis disaster forever changed the United States Navy. One painful lesson stood above all others. Ships could never simply disappear again. After World War II, the Navy dramatically improved its tracking systems. Every vessel's movements became carefully monitored. Communication procedures were rewritten. Distress signals received far greater priority. Search protocols became much faster. Today, if a modern naval vessel misses a scheduled report, immediate investigations begin. Those improvements exist because of Indianapolis, because hundreds of sailors paid the ultimate price for failures that should never have happened. The tragedy also transformed survival training. Future generations of American sailors learned directly from the experiences of the Indianapolis crew, how dehydration destroys judgment, how group discipline increases survival, how panic becomes as dangerous as the environment itself, how hope, even when almost gone, can keep people alive 1 hour longer. Those lessons have saved countless lives. Perhaps the most powerful legacy belongs to Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III. For decades, history remembered him as the captain who lost his ship. Today, history remembers something very different. A commander placed in an impossible situation. A man whose crew overwhelmingly defended him until the very end. A leader who stayed aboard while others escaped. A
captain who carried unbearable guilt for mistakes that were never truly his. His official exoneration came too late to change his life, but it changed history. It restored his honor, and for many families, that mattered deeply. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the man who fired the torpedoes, spent the rest of his life speaking openly about the battle. He never celebrated the sinking. Instead, he often expressed respect for the courage shown by the American sailors. After the war, former enemies sometimes met face to face. They shook hands, shared memories, spoke not as enemies, but as aging veterans who had survived one of history's greatest conflicts. War had once divided them. Time had united them through shared loss. Historians still debate one question: how many sailors were actually killed by sharks? The honest answer is, no one knows. Hollywood often portrays the Indianapolis disaster as a story almost entirely about sharks. Reality is more complicated. Many survivors certainly witnessed shark attacks. Modern marine biologists agree that oceanic white-tip sharks and possibly tiger sharks were present. Several attacks were documented by eyewitnesses, but historians believe that most deaths were caused by dehydration, exposure, injuries from the sinking, drowning, and exhaustion, while shark attacks, though horrifying and real, accounted for only part of the overall loss. That distinction matters because the greatest enemy the survivors faced was not a single predator, it was the ocean itself. The Pacific became a battlefield unlike any other, one that showed just how fragile the human body can be and just how powerful the human spirit truly is. Today, the names of all 1,195 men who served aboard USS Indianapolis are preserved in museums, memorials, military records, and history books. Visitors stand before the memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana. Some leave flowers, some salute, some simply stand quietly, reading name after name after name. Each one represents a life, a family, a dream interrupted by war. The memorial reminds every visitor that history is not made only by famous generals or political leaders. Sometimes, history is carried by ordinary young men asked to do extraordinary things. The mission that began in complete secrecy succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. USS Indianapolis successfully delivered the components that helped end World War II. Yet the ship herself never returned home. Her crew paid a price few Americans can truly imagine. Their courage did not end when the torpedoes struck. It continued through 4 days beneath a merciless sun, through thirst, through fear, through darkness, through hope that refused to die, even when the horizon remained empty. History remembers battles, history remembers victories, but sometimes history remembers endurance. The men of USS Indianapolis did not choose the nightmare that found them. They simply chose, again and again, not to give up. And perhaps that is why their story still matters nearly 80 years later. Not because it is the deadliest shark incident in history, not because it involved the atomic bomb, not because it became one of the greatest naval disasters ever recorded. It matters because it reveals what human beings are capable of when everything has been taken away except courage. Some stories fade with time, others grow stronger. The story of USS Indianapolis belongs to the second kind. As long as the Pacific Ocean stretches beyond the horizon, as long as sailors cross its waters, and as long as history is remembered, the voices of those 1,195 men will never truly be lost.